Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
Was designer on Steven Spielberg's Boom Blocks. He's also worked on Medal of Honor and Spider-Man. And he is one of the very, very smartest people in the games industry. Just a brilliant creative director. This might be a little too esoteric, and I like to think of him as the DeBotton of the games industry. On the other hand, he is the only person I have ever seen at any conference anywhere actually accidentally delete his slides while he was speaking. That's not a joke. You never know what's going to happen when the brilliant Tomo Moriwaki takes the stage.
So, Scott, I always thought you as the smart one. Thank you, by the way, and thanks to Casual Connect for having me. I'm grateful to be here. Hello, audience. This is a presentation about the player's experience. So, as the introductions indicated, my name is Tomo Moriwaki, and I design games. By the way, can I get a show of hands for people who would describe themselves as game designers, and not just with the title? Cool. Do you ever grapple with how to explain what you do to other people? Well, this is my personal favorite. I am a drug addict, designing drugs for my friends and myself in an effort to get a better high. And this is my story. From the very beginning, I played lots of games. I started young and did all the wrong things. I stared at the screen from way too close for way too long. And this combination here almost sent my life spiraling out of control. Which sounds a bit dramatic, considering how stationary I was during the whole affair. And I'm sure there were casualties from this. It's not clear what else I could do. And so eventually I started working at a tiny company called Treyarch. I leapt into the soup of uncertainty, swam around like a penguin with its head cut off, and surfaced with something cool. And as is often the case, when you have a very positive first experience with something, I became addicted and devoted to game making. Working in the console games industry, I had the opportunity to be a part of some very large and successful efforts. All of this was happening in a time when the industry was expanding and there was impressive growth in the audience. The business felt like it was on a great trajectory with no end in sight. But life was hectic. We were always trying to do more, not quite mastering our current context before moving on to the next larger one. Projects got big. Competition was fierce, and there were fewer and fewer titles with ever-growing budgets. We were busy, and we weren't looking while some new games emerged. Starting with Facebook and carried on by mobile, the number of people in the world who played games exploded. The growth from before was dwarfed. Change was coming, and now it was obvious. Oh, wrong button. I had so much experience, and things were going so well, but somehow I felt like the world was going to pass me by. What if I couldn't cope with the upcoming magnitude of the change? As it turns out, all this time, and I hadn't even thought to sit down and think about what I knew. So I was faced with an epic knot to untangle. What had I actually learned? What were the good parts and the bad parts? It was kind of a mess. I have a bit of advice, especially with the complexity that game designers regularly confront. Treat your own knowledge as you would a pet or your child. Pay close attention to it and make sacrifices for its cultivation. It's also critical for identifying when you're wrong. Designers don't just think what they're thinking, they think about why they're thinking it too. So, we're almost all the way to today in the story. A couple of years ago, I co-founded a small game studio. And aside from all the wonderful and terrifying things involved in starting something up, there was the benefit of having the buck stop with me. It's an excellent, if not intimidating, motivator for clarifying one's own thoughts. I'm not done with the big disk defrag, and I'm trying to learn new things as often as I can, which brings me to the present moment and the reason why I'm standing here today. This presentation is a way of embodying some of the lessons learned over the course of my career, and it's an example of my selfish commitment to improve. So this is the starting point, or the part of the story that comes after the setup. So what with all the changes that have been crammed down our throats lately, it's our ability to adapt that's increasing in relative value. And if that change keeps happening, the trend will keep continuing. One way to adapt is to distill what we know into a more basic form with the hopes of applying it more broadly. That said, the central element of my message today has to do with the problem that adaptation presents. But before I get into that, I'd like to establish something important. You grab the player's attention by making a change. Take this bomb, for example, and the subsequent explosion. The bomb changed. This is interesting. Something happened. We can try it again and increase the change to see how it feels. Seems better. So why not even bigger? At least when it comes to the moment, the bigger or more change there is, the better. However, the perceived size of a result is relative. Big relative changes feel big, and small relative changes feel small, even when the absolute change is equivalent or larger. To return to the idea of adaptation being a problem, if the perceived change is proportional to the current situation, then a sequence of additive results, regardless of their absolute magnitude, will decay in the eyes of the player. Each time we add one to the mix, the player's perspective is adapting or normalizing to the new context. They get used to what they've seen and expect more to get the same oomph out of any given result. You can feel it. It doesn't even take long. 6, maybe 7, and it starts to feel close enough to the same. If all you had was a per-event change in results and you wanted them each to feel even close to as large as the last one for a player, you'd be forced to deliver repeatedly scaling increases, which would very rapidly use up the available dynamic range in your systems of your experience. Before you know it, you'd be scraping against infinity. So how do we break out of the trap? And of course, the answer is surprise. The player is always building a model of your experience in their mind. The idea is take control of expectations, and then you deliver unexpected results. Predictability is a necessary component of surprise. I would go so far as to say that predictability rises as the potential for surprise rises. They're in lockstep relation in some ways. To extrapolate that out in the opposite direction, it also says that there is no surprise if there's no predictability. However, 100% predictability is not something to aspire to. In this description, predictability behaves much like altitude does in a potential versus kinetic energy analogy. The more predictable an experience is, the more energy is available to create surprise. So what does this mean? This means that the effort you spend to create patterns is in the service of creating interesting and entertaining results. Although, I suppose it's the same to say the reason why you have interesting and entertaining results is to gratify the potential energy of predictability. But this leads to a number of conclusions. And I'm not necessarily saying boring is good, but by this logic, there's utility to all forms of intensity. Any given feeling or feature of your experience becomes a useful tool for creating its opposite. And so the basis of long-term engagement is milking the dynamic range in your game systems for the most interesting series or sequence of results. You're building patterns to buy quality results at a discount, or getting more out of the fuel you consume. You only have 100% of your resources and time. Consider what your approach will be for how you balance efforts to build patterns versus efforts to deliver entertaining results. Your dynamic range is like a currency, and it can be wasted. Be wary of blowing too much of it too early, because doing so double dips into the quality of the experience, both in terms of getting them prematurely used to higher magnitude results, as well as stealing unnecessarily from the player's potential lifespan in the game. One might have a desire to take an approach of extreme repetition and small results at the beginning, hoping to get some really amazing results to happen later. But players might not get there if you don't treat them right along the way. Any experience will have highs and lows. The presentation so far is focused on the high points, and it's a natural thing to fixate on. It's all the attractive, memorable stuff. Considering the low points of your experience is essential for protecting yourself from losing the user. Imagine it's a defensive line, and it can't break. But you don't want to overspend there, because doing so would be stealing from the high highs. It points to a rationale or strategy for the way you use your resources to create player experience. So, the red line here is the player's experience as a series of event points, each of which have been set up as a predictability versus surprise sawtooth. The blue dashed line is a hypothetical user's willingness to continue playing. If the experience drops below that level, he leaves. It's angled upwards slightly in this example to describe how the player will want more and more as the experience continues. If you find points in your experience where players are leaving, you can imagine the situation like this. Some of the low points need to be aligned to meet the player's needs. We've all seen examples in games that seem to work really well. And I'm going to take a moment to kind of go through some of the things that we've seen in games leading up to today. I think if you analyze these features, you'll find that they all make a lot of sense in the framework of setting up patterns to create expectation and then results that can surprise the player without seeming arbitrary. There's often a lead up and a payoff. We've seen how some of these features from the past have been used in much wider ranges of contexts leading up to today. And it's worth mentioning that my examples and discussions have revolved primarily around the exponential growth or expansion. They can involve exponential slowdowns and inward scaling, at least insofar as progressively tunneling into the details of a thing. So there's an implication here that once we're playing with the user's expectations to create predictability, the energy that fuels the continued engagement or retention comes from the user himself or herself. The framework of the interactive experience is just a structure designed to pool that energy like a capacitor and spend it into interesting results. But the most important patterns to be playing against in your experience, in your audience, are the ones that are already present in the players. It's a massive set of expectations and potential energy. I would make the claim that it's what describes why some experiences are so much more meaningful to us, far out of proportion of the work that goes into making them. It's also where the designer has the most potential power and complexity to face. This is where you boldly make assumptions and force your product into a particular audience. This might be why appealing to the broadest possible audience is often extremely difficult. It also says that an audience isn't yours unless you understand them well enough to evoke a response. And that concludes the presentation, and I'd like to end with a slide that is a little bit of a motivational message. The myth of Sisyphus is about a guy who rolls a rock up a hill over and over and over again just to see it rolled back down to the ground. If taken in the context of the potential energy being predictability and the kinetic energy being surprise, then this becomes a good analogy for what we do as game makers. And I think by now we don't have to imagine that we're happy anymore. It's a very satisfying thing to embark upon. Thank you very much.
So we actually have plenty of time for questions, which is excellent because maybe you could give the For Dummies version of the presentation.
My problem with that is that it would take like 10 times as long, and I'm actually not, I'm not yet capable of that yet.
No. Excellent talk, and we would like to open the floor for questions for Tomo Moriwaki.
Anybody? Anybody?
This man over here, do we have a free roaming mic? Please keep your hands up while we've got two. There's one in the back.
So my question is kind of directed at the nature of games and how they relate to this theory of surprise and predictability. In that a game is a model that being explores in order to try to understand whatever context they're in. And so Sisyphus rolls the rock up the hill, he lets go, it rolls back down. And so that's what's the boring part, is there's nothing more to learn. But the games are getting to the point where complexity is part of it because the interactions are multiplicative. So if I add one more feature, now there's like 50 new things to learn. And so predictability goes out the window once I start augmenting past the base kind of development path. Once I have my mechanics down, maybe a few game loops in there, anything I add, I no longer can reliably say where the surprises should be, could be. I can't even control them anymore. There's just so many. It becomes almost pointless to continue with my main game, and I end up having to do like mini games in it. And I find that that's kind of the antithesis of my design. You know, I no longer can design anymore, and I feel like when I'm going to develop a product for market now, it's not about the design anymore, but about an extensible market that I can build. And I'm wondering if there's some secret or some formula beyond just looking at the market and seeing who's succeeded in terms of overall game design toward that path.
Well, to speak directly to what you said about adding a feature, decreasing predictability, and not having any control over your experience, my only recommendation there is identify what you want to have happen. What complexity does the user have to face next in your imagination? And backward engineer that complexity into your systems. The trick, or like, it becomes very easy to add something that you find interesting as its own unit into the system of what you've put together in your game experience. But that activity comes at a great risk, because it's not like it was devised with the rest of those systems in mind necessarily. And that's a dangerous pitfall as your complexity just, maybe even 3 or 4 steps in. That's already a very dangerous move to make. So you really need to establish what you want out of a player first, and then devise a system or a feature set that actually gets them there. And those things need to all be in alignment. Just because I have 4 systems doesn't mean I should have like 4 times 10, 4 times 10 to the 4th, or 1 times 10 to the 4th number of results. I mean, you want to highly normalize things. To do your work easiest, you want to be able to predict the user 100%, and that's not possible. And it's probably not even ideal. But so if you build your game to kind of as a balance between funneling the user down a normalized path and having there be room for interesting results, just controlling them so that they're the kinds of results that are good versus the kinds of results that you're waiting to see what they'll look like.
I actually have a question for mea culpa to anyone who has their hand raised out there. So football, basketball, baseball, these guys seem to have it figured out in terms of kind of infinite engagement. With the minute remaining, could you help us understand maybe what they're doing that we could be doing?
Well, I think sports have an infinite engagement path in much the same way that competitive multiplayer games do. By continuing to introduce new players and by having those teams fight against each other, the kind of chaotic twist that throws into the possible results is totally overwhelming and infinite. So, but it's not just an exponential scalar of those results. Those results fit along patterns, so you kind of know what to expect. And then when your expectations get met or exceeded or fell short, it forces the person, the viewer in this case, to correct their model of how they see the way the systems work. And I mean, in that regard, it's actually something I wanted to kind of say in the presentation, but didn't find a way to easily convey it, is that if you imagine a player's expectation and then them reading the results from like a screen, that's one of the most essential elements of gameplay. But it doesn't actually require an input of any sort. And so there's been lots of, like, a few years ago, they were talking about games that aren't games. I think that measuring a game for whether it has inputs that produce interesting results isn't nearly as important as understanding if a thing can produce interesting results in the same way a TV show or a movie or reading a book can do that.
Well, I have good news, everybody. One more? One more.
Regarding the balance between predictability and surprise, there's an established precedent that players are expecting within the game. What do you consider what would you define surprise as in that case when you're trying to deal with a predictability level?
So if I had to give it like a math value, it's just the marginal difference in results from the expectation of the player. And so the bigger it gets, the closer it gets to someone saying, yeah, that's actually a surprise. Falling short of that, they might not think that because they have some arbitrary line after which it's surprise, before which it's close enough to what they expected. But it's just playing with those marginal differences. Try to get them to think left and then present a right. With the only thing to add to that is that the surprise itself somehow be meaningful in informing the player on what the overall rules of the system are. That way it's building. I mean, that doesn't mean you can't just randomly surprise someone. I think that has a lot of merit. It's just that actual event kind of won't lead anywhere after that. It's kind of a one-off. And I mean, gimmicks are awesome. But think of it this way, as if your systems are really sound and elegantly fit together, that you're buying long-term engagement for cheaper. I don't have to do 75 different surprises. I can do 3 and combine them in interesting ways.
All right, I still have good news, people. Due to the Flynn effect, we are all now 20 IQ points higher for having listened to that. Thank you so much for that brilliant talk, Tomo. Everybody give it up for Tomo Moriwaki.
Thanks, everybody.